You sabotage your own success more than any competitor ever could, making decisions that destroy opportunities before they even arrive. Every day you watch as self-doubt, procrastination, and inner resistance defeat you more thoroughly than any external obstacle, while others with less talent somehow achieve what you cannot. I am Sun Tzu, the ancient strategist, who discovered that the greatest battles are won or lost within the mind before they ever reach the battlefield. What I learned about conquering the enemy within will transform how you approach every challenge in your life, giving you the ultimate victory mastery over your own thoughts and actions. The same principles that guided warriors to triumph over external foes can guide you to triumph over your greatest adversary, yourself. But first, like this video, subscribe for more battle-tested wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready to win the war within. When I was a young strategist serving under the feudal lords of ancient China, I believed victory came from superior weapons, larger armies, and better positioning on the external battlefield. I spent countless hours studying maps, analyzing enemy formations, and calculating supply lines. Yet I watched brilliant generals fail repeatedly, not because they lacked tactical knowledge, but because they had never mapped the terrain that mattered most, the landscape within their own minds. I remember the moment this truth revealed itself to me. During a crucial campaign against the state of Ku, I had positioned our forces perfectly. Every tactical advantage was ours. The enemy was outnumbered, outflanked, and operating far from their supply base. Victory should have been inevitable. Yet as dawn broke on the day of battle, I felt something I had never experienced before creeping. Doubt that began in my chest and spread through my thoughts like poison. That doubt whispered that perhaps I had miscalculated. Perhaps the enemy had reinforcements I hadn't detected. Perhaps my own allies would abandon me at the crucial moment. By the time our forces engaged, that internal enemy had already defeated me. My commands became hesitant, my positioning defensive, and what should have been a decisive victory became a costly stalemate. That night, as I reflected on the near disaster, I realized that all my external preparations meant nothing if I had not first conquered the battlefield within my own mind. The enemy I needed to defeat was not the general across the field, it was the voice of fear and uncertainty within myself. This is when I began developing what would become my most important teaching: know yourself and know your enemy. But I learned that day that you are your own enemy. The doubt, the fear, the pride, the anger, these internal forces shape every external decision you make. Master them, and external victory becomes almost inevitable. Remain their slave, and even the best external strategies will crumble. Most people spend their entire lives fighting the wrong battles. They focus on changing their circumstances, their competitors, their environment with, except the one factor that determines all outcomes: their own internal state. They are like generals who study every detail of enemy positions while remaining completely ignorant of the terrain their own army must cross. Your mind is a battlefield, and every day you either advance or retreat based on which internal forces gain control. The voice that tells you to delay important decisions, the fear that prevents you from seizing opportunities, the pride that stops you from learning from failures, the anger that clouds your strategic thinking. These are your real enemies, and until you recognize them as such, every external effort will be compromised by internal sabotage. Through decades of studying both victory and defeat, my own and that of others, I identified 5 internal enemies that destroy more dreams than any external force ever could. These enemies are so cunning that most people serve them faithfully, while believing they are fighting for their own success. The first enemy is fear, not the healthy caution that prevents foolish risks, but the paralyzing terror that prevents any action at all. I have seen brilliant strategists become ineffective because fear convinced them that every option led to disaster. Fear whispers that you are not ready, not qualified, not worthy. It presents itself as wisdom while ensuring you remain powerless. During the siege of Ying, I watched a capable general lose his entire army because fear of making the wrong decision prevented him from making any decision. While he deliberated, the enemy reinforced their position and his opportunity vanished. Forever, the second enemy is doubt. This insidious force undermines your confidence before you even begin. Doubt makes you question your abilities, your plans, your right to success. It creates hesitation at precisely the moments when bold action is required. I learned this lesson painfully when doubt caused me to second-guess a perfectly sound strategy. Against the state of key, my hesitation allowed the enemy to recognize my plan and counter it. What should have been a swift victory became a prolonged conflict that cost thousands of lives. The third enemy is anger. While fear and doubt paralyze, anger makes you reckless. It clouds strategic thinking and turns calculated decisions into emotional reactions. Anger wants immediate satisfaction rather than long-term victory. I once watched a promising young commander destroy his entire career in a single battle, because anger at a perceived insult caused him to abandon his strategic position and charge directly into an enemy trap. His army was decimated, his reputation ruined, all because he could not master the rage within his own heart. The fourth enemy is pride. This enemy is perhaps the most dangerous because it disguises itself as strength. Pride prevents you from learning from failure, from seeking advice, from adapting your strategies when circumstances change. It insists that admitting error is weakness, when in truth, the inability to acknowledge and correct mistakes is the ultimate weakness. Pride killed more generals in my era than enemy swords ever did, because proud leaders would rather fail spectacularly than succeed modestly by adjusting their approach. The fifth enemy is procrastination. This enemy destroys victory through delay. It convinces you that tomorrow will be better than today for taking action. It creates elaborate justifications for waiting, more information needed, better timing required, perfect conditions not yet present. But opportunity has its own timeline, and while you delay, circumstances change in favor of those who act decisively. I have seen perfect strategic opportunities lost forever because leaders chose the comfort of preparation over the risk of execution. These five enemies often work together, each reinforcing the others. Fear creates doubt. Doubt feeds procrastination. Procrastination breeds more fear, and pride prevents you from recognizing the cycle. Meanwhile, anger erupts when the consequences of this internal paralysis become undeniable, but by then it is too late for strategic thinking. The tragedy is that people spend enormous energy fighting external obstacles while these internal enemies sabotage every effort from within. The most seductive trap in warfare and in life is the illusion that your defeats come from external forces beyond your control. I have listened to countless generals explain their failures by citing bad weather, unreliable allies, superior enemy numbers, or unfavorable terrain. Each excuse contained elements of truth, which made them all the more dangerous. External factors do influence outcomes, but they rarely determine them. During my service in the courts of the feudal states, I observed a pattern that revealed itself repeatedly. The same commanders who blamed external circumstances for their defeats would, when given different conditions, find new external factors to blame for continued failures. The weather was too hot, then too cold. The terrain was too muddy, then too dry. The enemy was too aggressive, then too defensive. Always, the fault lay somewhere outside their own decisions and reactions. I remember General Wei, a man of considerable tactical knowledge who served the Duke of Lu. Wei possessed an impressive understanding of military formations and had studied the classics extensively, yet he lost battle after battle each time, with a perfectly reasonable explanation. The enemy had received unexpected reinforcements. His own supplies had been delayed by flooding. His cavalry had been affected by a disease among the horses. His allies had failed to arrive on schedule. Each excuse was factually accurate. Each external factor had indeed occurred. But when I studied Wei's campaigns more carefully, I noticed something revealing. Other generals faced similar external challenges, sometimes identical ones, yet achieved victory. The difference was not in the external circumstances, but in how each leader responded to those circumstances. This realization forced me to confront a painful truth about my own early defeats. I had spent considerable energy analyzing enemy strategies, weather patterns, and supply chain vulnerabilities while giving almost no attention to analyzing my own decision-making process. I studied every external variable except the one that determined how I would respond to those variables, my own mind. The moment I began taking complete responsibility for my outcomes, regardless of external factors, my strategic effectiveness increased dramatically, not because external factors ceased to matter, but because I stopped wasting mental energy on things I could not control and focused entirely on the one thing I could control: my own response. This shift in perspective revealed something profound. External blame is not just an excuse, it is a strategic choice that guarantees continued failure. When you attribute your defeats to external forces, you implicitly surrender your power to change the outcome. You position yourself as a victim of circumstances, rather than as the architect of your response to circumstances. The generals who consistently achieved victory, regardless of external conditions, shared one common trait: they accepted complete responsibility for their outcomes. They studied external factors not to assign blame, but to develop better responses. They understood that while they could not control the weather, they could control their preparation for different weather conditions. They could not control enemy actions, but they could control their adaptability to unexpected enemy tactics. True strategic power comes from recognizing that your response to any situation is always within your control, even when the situation itself is not. This recognition transforms you from a victim of circumstances into a master of your own destiny. I wrote that the supreme excellence consists in breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting. This principle, which guided my approach to external warfare, applies even more powerfully to the war within yourself. The ultimate victory is to subdue your own destructive impulses without the exhausting internal battles that drain your energy and weaken your resolve. Most people approach self-improvement like an endless series of battles against their own nature. They fight their impulses with willpower, resist their emotions with force, and try to overcome their limitations through sheer determination. This approach, while occasionally producing short-term results, inevitably leads to defeat because it treats symptoms rather than causes. I learned this lesson during a campaign against the state of Wu, when I faced a general known for his unpredictable and aggressive tactics. My initial instinct was to meet his aggression with superior force, to counter his unpredictability with rigid discipline. But as I studied his patterns more carefully, I realized that his apparent strength, his willingness to take enormous risks, was actually his greatest weakness. Instead of fighting his aggression directly, I created situations where his own aggressive nature would work against him. I positioned my forces to appear vulnerable in ways that would be irresistible to his temperament, then prepared responses that would turn his attacks into overextensions rather than defeating him through superior force. I allowed his own nature to defeat him. He destroyed himself, pursuing what appeared to be easy victories, while I remained positioned to capitalize on the chaos his overconfidence created. This experience taught me that the same principle applies to conquering yourself. Instead of fighting your destructive impulses with force, you can create conditions where those impulses work against themselves. Rather than battling procrastination with raw discipline, You can structure your environment so that taking action becomes easier than delaying. Instead of fighting fear with courage, you can design your approach so that movement forward feels safer than standing still. The key is understanding that your impulses, even the destructive ones, operate according to predictable patterns. They have triggers, conditions that strengthen them, and circumstances that weaken them. When you study these patterns with the same strategic mind you would apply to an external enemy, you can learn to influence them indirectly, rather than fighting them directly. Self-conquest, through positioning rather than force, creates several advantages. First, it requires far less energy than constant internal warfare. Second, it produces lasting change rather than temporary suppression. Third, it aligns your conscious intentions with your unconscious drives, instead of creating internal conflict. I discovered that when you stop fighting yourself and start strategically positioning yourself, something remarkable happens. The energy you previously spent in internal battles becomes available for external achievement. The mental clarity that was clouded by constant self-conflict becomes sharp and focused. The confidence that was undermined by repeated internal defeats becomes unshakable. This is why self-mastery is not about becoming a different person. It is about creating conditions where your best self naturally emerges. When you master the art of positioning yourself for success, rather than fighting yourself toward improvement, victory becomes not just possible, but inevitable. My most quoted principle states that if you know your enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. When applied to the internal war, this becomes even more crucial and infinitely more challenging. The enemy within is cunning precisely because it knows you intimately and can disguise itself as your own thoughts and desires. True self-knowledge requires the same ruthless objectivity I demanded when gathering intelligence about external enemies. You cannot afford the luxury of self-deception, wishful thinking, or comfortable lies about your own capabilities and limitations. The general who overestimates his army's strength or underestimates its weaknesses will face defeat as surely as the one who remains ignorant of enemy positions. I developed a systematic approach to self-assessment that served me throughout my military career. Each evening, I would conduct what I called the mirror campaign, an honest examination of my decisions, reactions, and results from that day. I asked myself specific questions. Where did fear influence my judgment? When did pride prevent me from seeing a better option? How did anger affect my strategic thinking? What opportunities did procrastination cost me? This practice was often painful. I discovered that my self-perception often differed dramatically from my actual behavior. I believed myself to be patient, yet my decisions frequently revealed impatience. I thought myself immune to flattery, yet I could trace several poor strategic choices to moments when my ego was skillfully manipulated by advisors. I prided myself on logical thinking, yet emotion had influenced more of my judgments than I wanted to admit. The most shocking discovery was how often I was completely unconscious of my own patterns. I would make the same type of mistake repeatedly without recognizing the pattern because each instance felt unique and justified by its specific circumstances. Only through systematic self-observation did these patterns become visible. Your internal enemy uses this unconsciousness as its primary weapon. It operates through habit, emotional reaction, and automatic thinking, precisely the mental processes that occur below the level of conscious awareness. You cannot defeat an enemy you cannot see, and you cannot see an enemy that has learned to move undetected through your own mind. Creating accurate self-knowledge requires developing what I call strategic detachment, the ability to observe your own thoughts, emotions, and behaviors with the same objectivity you would apply to studying an external opponent. This means noticing when you make excuses without immediately judging whether those excuses are valid. It means tracking your emotional reactions without being overwhelmed by them. It means observing your behavioral patterns without rushing to defend, or change them. Most people resist this level of self-examination because they fear what they might discover. But this fear itself reveals the enemy's strategy. Your internal opponent wants you to remain unconscious of its operations. It thrives in the darkness of unexamined assumptions and automatic reactions. The moment you begin genuine self-observation, you shift the balance of power in your favor. You cannot instantly change patterns that have developed over years, but you can begin to see them clearly. And what you can see clearly, you can eventually influence strategically. Speed is the essence of war. What is of supreme importance is to attack the enemy's strategy before it fully develops. In the internal war against self-sabotage, timing becomes even more critical because your enemy knows your patterns intimately and will adapt quickly to your attempts at change. I learned this lesson during a siege where my forces had surrounded an enemy city. The longer we delayed our assault, the stronger their defenses became. They used each day of our hesitation to reinforce weak points, gather supplies, and improve their strategic position. What could have been accomplished in hours through swift action eventually required weeks through prolonged siege. Your destructive patterns operate with the same principle. Each moment you delay taking action against self-sabotage allows those patterns to strengthen their hold on your behavior. Procrastination breeds more procrastination. Fear left unchallenged grows more powerful. Doubt that is not immediately countered with action spreads to contaminate other areas of your thinking. I have observed that there are specific moments when transformation becomes possible windows of opportunity when your normal resistance to change is temporarily weakened. These moments often occur after a significant failure, during periods of unusual clarity, or when external circumstances force you to question your current approach. These are your strategic moments, and they require immediate action. During my campaign against the state of Yan, I recognized that our enemy was vulnerable during their morning formations, a brief period, when their attention was focused internally on organization rather than external threats. This vulnerability lasted perhaps 30 minutes each day. Missing this window meant waiting another full day for the next opportunity, during which time they would strengthen their position and potentially discover our plans. Your internal patterns have similar windows of vulnerability. There are moments when your usual excuses seem less convincing, when your motivation is unusually high, when your clarity about necessary changes is strongest. These moments are gifts, and they demand immediate action. Waiting for perfect conditions or more preparation wastes these opportunities and allows your internal enemy to reinforce its defenses. The enemy within is particularly skilled at creating the illusion that delay is prudent. It will convince you that you need more information, better timing, additional resources, or greater certainty before making changes. But this is strategic misdirection. The enemy knows that momentum is crucial to lasting change, and delay kills momentum more effectively than any external obstacle. When you recognize the need for internal change, you must strike immediately at the pattern while your awareness is sharp and your motivation is strong. Hesitation allows the familiar neural pathways to reassert themselves, the comfortable rationalizations to re-emerge, and the status quo to regain its grip on your behavior. Swift action against your own destructive patterns creates several advantages. It prevents the enemy from adapting to your new strategy. It builds confidence through immediate results. It establishes new neural pathways before old ones can reassert themselves. Most importantly, it sends a clear signal to your unconscious mind that you are serious about change. All warfare is based on deception, but the war within yourself requires a different approach. Honesty about your own vulnerabilities, combined with strategic positioning that makes those vulnerabilities irrelevant. The supreme skill is to position yourself so that failure becomes nearly impossible and success becomes almost inevitable. During my study of defensive strategies, I learned that the strongest fortresses were not built through superior walls alone, but through positioning that made direct assault impractical. The best defensive positions forced enemies to attack uphill, across difficult terrain, or in ways that negated their natural advantages. These positions turned the enemy's strength against itself. Your mind requires the same strategic positioning. Instead of relying on willpower to overcome destructive impulses, you must create conditions where those impulses lose their power naturally. This means designing your environment, your routines, and your decision-making processes to support your desired outcomes without requiring constant internal battles. I discovered this principle during a campaign where my forces were significantly outnumbered. Rather than meeting the enemy in direct confrontation where their superior numbers would prevail, I positioned my army in a narrow mountain pass where they could only attack us with a small portion of their force at any time. Their numerical advantage became irrelevant because the terrain prevented them from using it effectively. Your environment functions as terrain in the internal war. If you struggle with distraction, positioning yourself in environments that naturally focus attention eliminates the need for constant vigilance. If you battle procrastination, creating systems where action is easier than delay removes the internal friction that feeds hesitation. If you fight against negative thinking, surrounding yourself with inputs that naturally generate positive thoughts makes optimism effortless rather than forced. The key insight is that most people try to overcome their weaknesses through strength, when they should instead position themselves so that their weaknesses become irrelevant. A recovering alcoholic does not overcome addiction by strengthening willpower. They position themselves away from alcohol and create support systems that make sobriety easier than drinking. I learned to apply this principle to my own strategic thinking by creating what I called decision fortresses, structured approaches, two important choices that prevented emotion and bias from corrupting my judgment. When facing crucial strategic decisions, I would remove myself from the immediate pressure of the situation, gather specific types of information in a predetermined order, and consult advisors according to an established protocol. This positioning eliminated the chaos that typically surrounds important decisions. Instead of making choices under stress, with incomplete information, influenced by whatever emotions happened to be dominant at the moment, I could approach each decision from a position of strength and clarity. You can create similar fortresses in your own life: morning routines that position you for productive days, evening rituals that ensure restorative sleep, financial systems that make saving automatic and spending deliberate, relationship boundaries that preserve your energy for meaningful connections, professional habits that make excellence your default mode rather than an exceptional effort. The ultimate goal is to reach a position where good choices require less energy than bad ones, where productive actions feel more natural than destructive ones, where your environment supports your intentions instead of undermining them. The most sophisticated enemy strategies involve making the opponent defeat themselves while believing they are acting rationally. In warfare, this might involve spreading false intelligence that causes an enemy to abandon a strong position or retreat when advance would bring victory. In the internal war, your mind employs similar deceptions through beliefs that appear logical but actually prevent you from accessing your true capabilities. I encountered this phenomenon during my service with Dukeling of Wei. Our forces had achieved a remarkable strategic position against a larger enemy army, but several of my fellow commanders argued that we should retreat because prudence demands avoiding battles where we are outnumbered. This belief appeared entirely reasonable numerically. We were indeed at a disadvantage, yet this apparent wisdom ignored crucial factors: our superior positioning, the enemy's supply problems, and their poor morale. When I challenged this belief by proposing specific tactical approaches that would negate their numerical advantage, something interesting occurred. The commanders did not evaluate these tactics on their merits. Instead, they defended their original belief more vigorously, finding new reasons why numerical superiority made victory impossible. The belief had become more important than the analysis. This taught me that limiting beliefs function like enemy agents operating within your own mind. They present themselves as objective assessments of reality, while actually serving to prevent action that would threaten their continued existence. They are particularly cunning because they often contain elements of truth that make them difficult to challenge. The belief that I am not qualified for this opportunity might be based on accurate assessment of current skill levels, but it ignores your capacity to develop those skills. The belief that success requires sacrificing personal relationships might be supported by examples of others who made that choice, but it assumes that their approach is the only possible path. The belief that people like me do not achieve that level of success might reference genuine statistical patterns while ignoring the individuals who transcended those patterns. These beliefs are particularly dangerous because they feel protective. They appear to shield you from disappointment, rejection, or failure by preventing you from attempting what might not succeed. But this protection comes at the cost of also preventing you from discovering what you might actually be capable of achieving. During my later campaigns, I developed a practice of systematically questioning beliefs that suggested limitation or impossibility. When faced with a strategic challenge that appeared insurmountable, I would ask, what would need to be true for this to become possible? This question forced me to examine the assumptions underlying my initial assessment. Often, I discovered that what appeared impossible was simply unfamiliar. What seemed unrealistic was merely untested. What felt overwhelming was actually complex, but manageable when broken into smaller components. The belief in impossibility had prevented me from even exploring potential solutions. Your limiting beliefs operate through the same mechanism. They convince you that certain outcomes are impossible, certain paths are closed to you, certain capabilities are beyond your reach. They present this as objective reality when it is actually untested assumption. They maintain their power by preventing you from gathering evidence that might challenge their accuracy. The antidote to limiting beliefs is not positive thinking, but strategic testing. Instead of fighting the belief directly, you can design small experiments that test its validity without requiring enormous risk or commitment. Know your enemy and know yourself. In 100 battles, you will never be in peril. But gathering accurate intelligence about an enemy that lives within your own mind requires methods more sophisticated than any external reconnaissance. Your internal enemy can disguise itself as rational thought, justified emotion, or necessary caution. It can make self-destructive patterns feel like reasonable responses to circumstances. In my military campaigns, I learned that the most valuable intelligence was not dramatic revelations about enemy plans, but mundane details about their daily patterns. When do they eat? How do they organize their watch rotations? What are their morale cycles? How do they respond to different types of pressure? These seemingly minor details revealed exploitable weaknesses that grand strategic intelligence often missed. Your own behavioral patterns follow similar rhythms that become invisible through familiarity. You develop automatic responses to stress, predictable reactions to criticism, habitual ways of avoiding difficult decisions. These patterns operate below conscious awareness because they feel natural and justified in each specific moment. I developed a systematic approach to gathering intelligence about my own decision-making patterns. Each week, I would review critical decisions from the previous 7 days and analyze them with the same objectivity I applied to studying enemy movements. I asked specific questions. What emotions influenced this choice? What assumptions did I make without verification? What information did I ignore or minimize? How did my energy levels affect my judgment? This analysis revealed disturbing patterns I had never noticed. I discovered that I made significantly worse strategic decisions when hungry, that I became overly optimistic immediately after victories, and that I avoided necessary confrontations when facing multiple sources of stress simultaneously. These insights were humbling, but invaluably they allowed me to recognize when my judgment was compromised and adjust accordingly. The challenge in gathering accurate self-intelligence is that your mind naturally resists this type of examination. It prefers comfortable narratives about your motivations and behavior, rather than objective data about your actual patterns. Your internal enemy will provide elaborate justifications for destructive choices, while making beneficial patterns seem accidental or temporary. Effective self-surveillance requires treating yourself as if you were an external subject, requiring study. This means tracking actual behavior rather than intended behavior, noting patterns across time rather than focusing on individual incidents, and paying attention to results rather than justifications. I began keeping what I called a strategic journal, not a record of events, but an analysis of my own responses to those events. When I felt confident, what specific factors contributed to that confidence? When I hesitated, what fears or doubts drove that hesitation? When I acted decisively, what conditions supported that decisiveness? Over time, this practice revealed that my internal states followed more predictable patterns than I had ever imagined. My creativity peaked at specific times of day. My susceptibility to fear increased under certain circumstances. My ability to maintain long-term perspective fluctuated based on identifiable triggers. Understanding these patterns gave me strategic advantages in managing my own effectiveness. I could schedule important decisions during my periods of clearest thinking, anticipate when I would be vulnerable to particular forms of self-sabotage, and create systems that supported my better judgment during times when that judgment might be compromised. The supreme skill consists in breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting major battles. This principle, which I applied to external warfare, proves even more powerful in the internal war against self-sabotage. Most people attempt dramatic transformations that require enormous willpower and inevitably collapse under their own weight. The strategic approach is to accumulate small victories that compound into unstoppable momentum. I learned this lesson during a prolonged campaign against the state of Key, where we faced an enemy too strong to defeat in direct confrontation. Their capital was protected by formidable walls. Their army was larger than ours, and they controlled superior defensive positions. Any direct assault would have resulted in catastrophic losses with little chance of success. Instead of risking our entire force in a decisive battle, I focused on winning small engagements that gradually weakened their position. We captured their supply convoys, eliminating their ability to sustain prolonged resistance. We eliminated their scouts, blinding them to our movements and intentions. We harassed their flanks during movements, wearing down their morale and energy. We disrupted their communications, creating confusion and preventing coordinated responses to our actions. Each individual victory was minor: capturing a supply train, defeating a patrol, taking an outpost. My officers sometimes questioned whether these small actions were worth the effort when the main enemy force remained intact. But I understood that wars are won through accumulated advantages, not single dramatic gestures. After months of these small victories, something remarkable occurred. The enemy's resistance began to crumble, not from any decisive defeat, but from the accumulated weight of countless minor losses. Their supplies ran low, their information networks failed, their confidence eroded, and their coordination deteriorated. When we finally approached their capital, they surrendered without a major battle because their capacity to resist had been systematically destroyed through many small defeats. Your destructive patterns possess the same type of resilience that protected my enemies. They cannot be defeated through single dramatic efforts. but they can be gradually weakened through consistent small actions that accumulate over time. The pattern of procrastination that is developed over years cannot be eliminated in a day, but it can be undermined through daily practices that make action slightly easier and delay slightly more difficult. The genius of this approach lies in its psychological sustainability. Small victories require modest effort, but generate disproportionate confidence. When you succeed at a minor challenge, your mind begins to believe that larger successes are possible. Each small victory provides evidence that contradicts the limiting beliefs that fuel self-sabotage. I remember during my campaign against Key, after we had captured our 5th supply convoy, I noticed a change in my soldiers' demeanor. They began to walk with more confidence, speak with greater certainty about our eventual victory, and approach each engagement with the expectation of success rather than hope for survival. These small victories had transformed their identity. From desperate defenders to inevitable conquerors, your internal transformation follows the same pattern. The moment when destructive patterns suddenly lose their grip on your behavior appears dramatic, but it represents the culmination of many small victories that gradually shifted the balance of power in your favor. I developed a systematic approach to creating these small victories by identifying the minimum effective dose of positive action required to maintain forward momentum. Instead of attempting to exercise for hours when I had been sedentary, I would commit to movement that could be sustained regardless of circumstances, perhaps walking for 10 minutes or performing basic stretches. Instead of trying to eliminate all sources of distraction when studying strategic texts, I would focus on creating brief periods of concentrated attention that felt achievable rather than overwhelming. These minor commitments appeared insignificant individually, but they created something powerful, proof that I could influence my own behavior predictably. Each time I honored a small commitment to myself, my confidence in my ability to honor larger commitments increased. More importantly, these small actions began to feel natural rather than forced, creating new neural pathways that supported beneficial choices. The compound effect of small victories extends beyond their immediate impact. They create positive identity shifts that support larger changes. When you consistently take small actions toward your goals, you begin to see yourself as someone who follows through on commitments. This identity change makes larger commitments feel more natural and sustainable. Small victories also create momentum that becomes increasingly difficult to stop. Each success builds energy for the next action, creating an upward spiral that carries you forward even when motivation fluctuates. Most importantly, small victories are sustainable during difficult periods when dramatic efforts would collapse, when external circumstances create stress, when motivation is low, when obstacles appear overwhelming. Small, consistent actions maintain forward progress without requiring reserves of willpower you may not possess. There are times when the wise general retreats, not from cowardice, but from strategic understanding that some battles cannot be won under current conditions. The same principle applies to the internal war. Sometimes the most powerful response to destructive impulses is strategic withdrawal rather than direct confrontation. I learned this lesson during a campaign where my forces encountered an enemy army positioned so advantageously that any direct assault would have resulted in catastrophic losses. They held the high ground, controlled the only water sources in the region, and had positioned themselves where our superior numbers could not be brought to bear effectively. My officers, eager to prove their courage and concerned about appearing weak to our allies, argued for immediate attack. They viewed retreat as weakness and defeat, but I recognized that engaging under those conditions would serve the enemy's interests, not ours. They had chosen the battlefield precisely because it negated our advantages while maximizing theirs. Fighting them, they would be like attacking a fortress through its strongest gate, while ignoring undefended approaches. We withdrew to terrain more favorable to our tactics, where the enemy's positional advantage became irrelevant and our mobility could be used effectively. What my officers initially saw as defeat became the foundation for a decisive victory. 3 days later, the temporary retreat preserved our strength and positioned us for success under better conditions. Your internal impulses often present themselves in similarly overwhelming circumstances. The urge to procrastinate feels strongest when you are tired, stressed, or overwhelmed precisely when your willpower is at its weakest. The temptation to abandon long-term goals peaks during moments of frustration or discouragement when the gap between your current reality and desired outcomes feels insurmountable. Anger erupts when your emotional reserves are already depleted by other stressors and your usual self-regulation resources are unavailable. Fighting these impulses directly under such conditions is like launching an uphill assault against a fortified position. You may occasionally succeed through extraordinary effort, but more often you will exhaust yourself in battles that could be avoided entirely through strategic positioning. I developed a systematic approach to recognizing when retreat was the superior strategy. When I noticed destructive impulses gaining strength, I would first assess my current resources, energy levels, emotional state, external pressures, available support. If these factors suggested I was fighting from a position of weakness, I would temporarily withdraw from the situation rather than risk a defeat that would strengthen the destructive pattern. This might mean removing myself physically from triggering environments, postponing important decisions until my judgment was clearer, or asking others to handle responsibilities that were likely to trigger negative reactions. The key was recognizing these actions as strategic advances rather than failures of willpower. During one particularly challenging period of my military service, I faced criticism from subordinates who questioned my decision to avoid a battle where we were outnumbered 3-1. They accused me of cowardice and suggested that our reputation would suffer if we continued to avoid direct confrontation. But I understood that a single defeat would cost us more than multiple strategic withdrawals ever could. The most important aspect of strategic retreat is ensuring that it serves your larger objectives rather than enabling avoidance. True strategic withdrawal prepares you for future engagement under better conditions. False retreat simply postpones necessary confrontation, while allowing destructive patterns to strengthen. I learned to distinguish between these by examining my intentions during withdrawal. Was I retreating to preserve my strength for a better opportunity, or was I simply avoiding discomfort? Was I positioning myself for future success, or was I hoping the problem would resolve itself without my intervention? Was I gathering resources and intelligence that would improve my chances of victory, or was I simply delaying inevitable defeat? Strategic retreat requires the same type of planning as strategic advance. You must identify the conditions under which you will re-engage, the resources you will gather during withdrawal, and the specific advantages you hope to gain through temporary disengagement. Without this planning, retreat becomes avoidance, and avoidance strengthens the very patterns you are trying to overcome. When executed properly, strategic retreat from your own impulses becomes one of your most powerful tools for self-mastery. It prevents unnecessary defeats that would strengthen destructive patterns. It preserves your energy for battles you can actually win. Most importantly, it demonstrates that you can choose your battles rather than being forced to fight every impulse immediately upon its appearance. Ground is the factor on which the outcome of the entire war depends. In my military campaigns, I learned that controlling key terrain could determine victory before the first sword was drawn. The general who positions his forces on commanding heights near reliable water sources with secure supply lines and protected flanks gains advantages that tactical brilliance alone cannot overcome. Your daily habits function as this crucial terrain in the war against self-sabotage. Most people underestimate the strategic importance of habits because each individual action appears insignificant. Making your bed seems trivial compared to major life decisions. Reading for 10 minutes feels meaningless when measured against career objectives. A brief morning routine appears to have no connection to significant achievements. But these small, repeated actions create the terrain on which all your other battles are fought. I observed this principle during the siege of a fortress that had resisted conquest for months under previous commanders. The defenders' strength came not from their walls alone, though those were formidable, but from their meticulous daily routines that maintained discipline, preserved resources, and sustained morale under extreme pressure. Their habit of maintaining strict watch schedules meant that surprise attacks were virtually impossible. Someone was always alert and ready to sound warnings. Their practice of rationing supplies according to predetermined schedules ensured they could sustain resistance far longer than besieging armies expected. Their routine of maintaining equipment kept their defenses in optimal condition, despite constant wear from weather and conflict. Most importantly, their disciplined daily practices created psychological resilience that allowed them to endure hardship without losing hope or unity. Each day began with the same rituals that reminded them of their identity and purpose. Each evening ended with routines that processed the day's stress and prepared them for restorative sleep. When we finally breached their defenses, it was not because we had discovered some tactical weakness in their fortifications. It was because we had systematically disrupted these supportive routines. We attacked their supply convoys to force changes in rationing habits that created internal stress and conflict. We conducted irregular harassment at unpredictable times to disrupt their sleep schedules and wear down their physical reserves. We spread misinformation through spies to create confusion in their communication routines and decision-making processes. Once their supportive habits collapsed, their resistance crumbled rapidly despite the continued strength of their physical defenses. The fortress that had withstood months of assault fell within days once the routines that sustained the defenders' effectiveness were destroyed. Your destructive patterns depend on habitual terrain that supports their continued existence. Procrastination thrives when your environment lacks structure and clear priorities, when your day begins without direction and proceeds without meaningful milestones. Fear grows stronger when you habitually focus attention on potential dangers rather than available opportunities, when your mental diet consists primarily of negative news and worst-case scenarios. Doubt flourishes when you regularly consume information that reinforces uncertainty rather than building confidence. When you surround yourself with people who question every decision rather than supporting thoughtful action. Self-sabotage patterns become entrenched when your environment makes destructive choices easier than beneficial ones, but you can create habitual terrain that supports your success instead of undermining it. Morning routines that ensure you begin each day with clarity about priorities and energy for pursuing them. Evening practices that process the day's experiences constructively and prepare your mind for restorative sleep. Weekly reviews that maintain perspective on long-term goals despite daily fluctuations in progress and motivation. Monthly assessments that adjust strategies based on accumulated evidence rather than emotional reactions to recent events. Quarterly deep evaluations that ensure your methods are still serving your evolving objectives and circumstances. The power of beneficial habits lies not in their individual impact but in their cumulative effect over time. Each positive action may seem insignificant when measured against your ultimate goals, but together they create momentum that makes continued progress feel natural rather than forced. They establish neural pathways that make beneficial choices automatic rather than requiring constant conscious decision-making. More importantly, beneficial habits create identity shifts that support lasting change. When you consistently honor commitments to yourself, through small daily actions. You begin to see yourself as someone who follows through on promises. When you regularly choose long-term benefits over immediate gratification, you develop identity as someone who makes wise decisions. When you maintain beneficial routines despite fluctuating motivation, you become someone who achieves goals through discipline rather than relying on inspiration. This identity transformation is perhaps the most powerful aspect of controlling your habitual terrain. Once you see yourself as someone who naturally makes beneficial choices, those choices require less willpower to maintain because they align with your self-concept rather than conflicting with it. The skillful strategist defeats the enemy without any fighting. He captures their cities without laying siege to them. He overthrows their kingdom without lengthy operations in the field. The greatest victory is achieved when different factions within your own nature cease their internal warfare and unite toward common objectives. I learned this principle during complex negotiations between warring states, where the most successful outcomes occurred not when one side defeated another through force, but when previously opposing forces recognized shared interests and combined their strengths toward mutual benefit. The most powerful alliances were forged not through conquest, but through demonstrating that cooperation served everyone's interests better than continued conflict. The same dynamic applies within your own mind, where different aspects of your personality often wage unnecessary civil wars that drain energy and prevent progress toward meaningful goals. Your rational mind wants long-term success, but struggles with the immediate gratification that your emotional nature craves. Your emotional nature seeks connection and meaning, but fears the rejection and failure that your survival instincts are designed to avoid. Your survival instincts prioritize safety and comfort, but may resist the risks and discomfort required for growth and achievement. These different aspects of yourself are not enemies to be defeated. They are potential allies whose legitimate concerns must be addressed and whose unique strengths can be channeled toward shared goals that serve your highest potential. During my service with various feudal lords, I observed that the strongest armies were not those with the most skilled individual warriors, but those where different units worked in perfect coordination. Cavalry that supported infantry movements rather than competing for glory in independent charges. Archers who timed their volleys to complement ground assaults rather than shooting independently for individual recognition. Engineers who positioned siege equipment to enhance rather than interfere with other tactical elements. Supply units that anticipated the needs of combat forces rather than simply responding to requests. Scouts who gathered intelligence that informed overall strategy rather than merely satisfying their own curiosity about enemy positions. Each unit maintained its specialized function while contributing to objectives that no single unit could achieve independently. Your internal unity requires the same type of coordination. Instead of forcing your emotional nature to submit to pure logic, you can acknowledge its need for meaning and connection while directing those needs toward productive ends that also satisfy your rational objectives. Instead of suppressing your survival instincts, you can honor their wisdom about genuine dangers while helping them distinguish between real threats that require caution and imaginary fears that prevent beneficial action. I discovered that internal alignment begins with recognizing that all aspects of your nature developed for legitimate reasons and continue to serve important functions when properly directed. Your tendency toward caution exists because risks can indeed be dangerous, and this caution can become prudent, strategic thinking rather than paralyzing fear. Your desire for approval emerged because social connection is genuinely important for human well-being, and this desire can motivate excellence and contribution rather than desperate people-pleasing. Your preference for comfort serves the valid purpose of conserving energy for truly important challenges, and this preference can inspire you to create sustainable systems rather than seeking immediate gratification that undermines long-term objectives. The key is not eliminating these drives, but redirecting them toward beneficial outcomes that honor their underlying wisdom while serving your larger purposes. This requires what I call diplomatic negotiation with different aspects of your own nature. When your survival instincts resist a challenging but necessary action, you can acknowledge their concern for your safety while demonstrating that the greater danger lies in avoiding the action rather than taking it. When your emotional nature demands immediate satisfaction, you can honor its need for reward while showing how delayed gratification leads to more satisfying outcomes. When your rational mind becomes impatient with the time required for sustainable change, you can respect its desire for efficiency while explaining how gradual progress prevents the setbacks that make rapid approaches ultimately slower. This internal alliance transforms the energy previously wasted in self-conflict into power, available for external achievement. When your rational mind, emotional nature, and survival instincts work together rather than against each other, you gain access to capabilities that none of these aspects could achieve independently. Your rational mind provides strategic thinking and long-term planning. Your emotional nature supplies motivation, creativity, and the energy needed to sustain effort over time. Your survival instincts contribute awareness of real dangers and the determination needed to persevere through difficulties. Together, they create a unified force far more powerful than any individual aspect operating alone. Water shapes its course according to the nature of the ground over which it flows. The soldier works out his victory in relation to the foe he is facing. In the internal war, you must adapt your strategies as you conquer different aspects of yourself, because the approaches that overcome initial weaknesses may become obstacles to further development. I learned this lesson during a prolonged campaign, where tactics that had brought early victories began producing defeats as the enemy adapted to our methods. What had been surprising became predictable. What had been innovative became outdated. What had been our greatest strength became a limitation that prevented us from responding effectively to changing circumstances. In the early phases of this campaign, our success came from rapid, unexpected movements that caught enemy forces off guard. Our ability to strike quickly and withdraw before they could organize effective responses gave us significant advantages. But as the conflict continued, our enemies began anticipating these tactics and positioning their forces to counter them. What had been our greatest asset, speed and unpredictability, became a liability when the enemy learned to prepare for exactly those qualities. We found ourselves trapped by our own success, unable to adapt because we had become too attached to methods that no longer served us effectively. Your journey of self-mastery follows similar phases, each requiring different approaches and presenting unique challenges. The strategies that help you overcome initial procrastination may not serve you when the challenge becomes managing abundance rather than scarcity. The methods that build initial confidence may need adjustment when confidence becomes overconfidence that blinds you to continued learning opportunities. The systems that create structure in chaos may require modification when structure becomes rigidity that prevents you from adapting to new opportunities and circumstances. During my early campaigns, I relied heavily on detailed planning and careful preparation because I lacked experience with battlefield adaptation. This approach served me well when facing predictable enemies operating in familiar territories with conventional tactics. My thorough preparation compensated for my limited intuitive understanding of warfare dynamics. But when I encountered opponents who specialized in improvisation and rapid changes of tactics, my preference for detailed planning became a weakness. I was so committed to executing predetermined strategies that I missed opportunities requiring immediate adaptation to unexpected developments. My strength had become a limitation that prevented growth. This taught me that even beneficial patterns can become limitations when circumstances change. The discipline that builds initial success can become inflexibility that prevents innovation. The focus that enables achievement can become tunnel vision that misses new opportunities arising from changed conditions. The confidence that overcomes early obstacles can become arrogance that ignores valuable feedback from evolving situations. Your internal evolution requires constant strategic adjustment because success itself changes the nature of your challenges. The motivation techniques that work when you are building momentum may differ from those needed when maintaining long-term progress through periods of apparent plateau. The accountability systems that support you during periods of weakness may need modification when you develop greater internal strength and no longer require external pressure to maintain beneficial behaviors. The environmental controls that help establish new habits may require relaxation once those habits become natural and self-sustaining. I developed a practice of quarterly strategic reviews, where I examined not just my progress toward goals, but the effectiveness of my methods themselves, which approaches were still serving me well and producing continued improvement, which had become automatic but ineffective, producing activity without meaningful results. What new challenges required different strategies that I had not yet developed? What strengths had I developed that could support approaches previously beyond my capability? These reviews often revealed that methods I had credited with previous successes were no longer producing proportional results. Strategies that had once required significant effort to implement had become so natural that they no longer challenged me to grow. Approaches that had been necessary during earlier phases of development had become unnecessary or even counterproductive as my capabilities evolved. This regular adaptation prevented my strategies from becoming rigid dogma that served my ego more than my actual development. It ensured that my methods evolved along with my capabilities and circumstances. Most importantly, it kept me focused on results rather than attachment to particular approaches, allowing me to change tactics while maintaining consistent direction toward long-term objectives. The key insight is that your relationship with challenge must evolve as you grow stronger. What once seemed impossible becomes routine. What once required extraordinary effort becomes natural. What once felt overwhelming becomes manageable. This growth is positive, but it requires you to seek new challenges that stretch your expanded capabilities rather than remaining comfortable with achievements that no longer require your best effort. The highest form of warfare is to attack the enemy's strategy. The next highest is to attack their alliances. The next highest is to attack their army. The lowest form is to attack cities. In achieving final victory over yourself, you transcend the need for constant battles because you have transformed the very conditions that created internal conflict. True self-mastery is not the ability to force yourself into beneficial behavior through willpower, nor is it the capacity to endure suffering while pursuing worthy goals. It is the integration of all aspects of your nature into a unified force directed toward objectives that serve your highest potential while honoring the legitimate needs of every aspect of your being. When this integration is complete, beneficial choices feel natural rather than forced. Productive actions require less energy than destructive ones, and your external achievements flow from internal alignment rather than internal struggle. I witnessed this principle during my observation of master strategists who had transcended the need for complex tactics and elaborate preparations. Their victories appeared effortless because they had developed such deep understanding of warfare that they could achieve objectives through positioning and timing rather than force. They won battles before fighting became necessary by creating conditions where their desired outcomes became inevitable. These masters did not possess superior physical strength or extraordinary courage. They had achieved something more powerful: complete harmony between their strategic thinking, emotional responses, and instinctive reactions. When they encountered challenges, all aspects of their nature worked together to generate solutions, rather than creating internal conflict that complicated external problems. Your journey towards self-mastery follows similar stages of development, each building upon the foundations established in previous phases. Initially, you must fight conscious battles against destructive impulses, using willpower and discipline to override automatic patterns that have developed over years of unconscious conditioning. This stage is necessary, but exhausting it requires constant vigilance and consumes enormous mental energy that could otherwise be directed toward creative and productive activities. The intermediate stage involves creating systems and environments that support beneficial choices without requiring constant conscious effort. You design your life so that good decisions become easier than bad ones. Productive actions feel more natural than destructive ones, and external structures compensate for internal weaknesses while you develop greater internal strength. During this phase, you learn to work with your own psychology rather than against it, positioning yourself for success rather than relying solely on willpower to overcome poor positioning. You create momentum through small victories, use strategic retreat when fighting from positions of weakness, and build habits that support your objectives automatically. The advanced stage transcends the need for external systems by achieving internal integration, where beneficial choices arise naturally from your unified being rather than from imposed discipline or environmental manipulation. This does not mean you no longer face challenges or never experience internal resistance. It means your response to challenges becomes so aligned and automatic that overcoming obstacles feels natural rather than forced. During my later years of military service, I experienced this integration in strategic thinking. The analytical processes that had once required deliberate effort became automatic responses to tactical situations. The emotional regulation that had once demanded conscious control became natural reactions that served strategic objectives. The long-term perspective that had once conflicted with immediate desires became my default way of viewing situations. This transformation did not eliminate challenges, it changed my relationship with challenges in fundamental ways. Instead of fighting against obstacles, I learned to flow around them like water finding the most efficient path through terrain. Instead of forcing solutions through superior effort, I created conditions where solutions emerged naturally from the dynamics of the situation itself. Instead of battling my own limitations through willpower, I positioned myself where those limitations became irrelevant to achieving my objectives. The final victory over yourself creates several profound changes that extend far beyond personal achievement. First, your energy is no longer consumed by internal conflict, freeing enormous resources for external achievement and service to others. Second, your decision-making becomes more reliable because it arises from integrated wisdom rather than competing impulses that must be resolved through exhausting internal negotiations. Third, your influence on others increases dramatically because you model the integration they seek for themselves. People are naturally drawn to those who have achieved internal harmony because such individuals radiate a calm confidence that others find both attractive and inspiring. Most importantly, achieving mastery over yourself serves purposes beyond personal success or even personal fulfillment. When you are no longer driven by unconscious fears, desperate needs, or defensive reactions, you become capable of contributing to others from abundance rather than neediness. Your presence becomes calming rather than draining because you are not trying to extract energy or validation from interactions. Your achievements inspire rather than intimidate because they demonstrate what becomes possible when internal conflicts are resolved, rather than simply highlighting others' current limitations. This is why the ancient masters taught that conquering yourself is the foundation of all other accomplishments. Until you achieve internal unity, Your external efforts are compromised by internal sabotage that operates below conscious awareness. Once you achieve that unity, your external possibilities become unlimited because they are no longer constrained by the internal conflicts that had previously dissipated your energy and confused your decision-making. The final victory is not a destination you reach and then maintain effortlessly. It is a dynamic state of integration that must be renewed through continued growth, service, and contribution to purposes larger than your individual needs and desires. The principles of warfare that guided armies 2,500 years ago remain relevant because human nature itself has not fundamentally changed. The same strategic thinking that determined victory on ancient battlefields can be applied to the modern challenges of conquering self-sabotage in a world of constant distraction, information overload, and unprecedented rates of change. Your modern war plan against the enemy within must account for contemporary challenges that did not exist in my era while remaining grounded in timeless principles that govern human psychology and strategic thinking. The average person today faces more decisions in a single day than many ancient rulers faced in months. Your attention is constantly fragmented by notifications, media, and competing demands that make sustained focus increasingly difficult to maintain. Your environment changes more rapidly than your psychological systems can adapt to comfortably, creating stress and uncertainty that can trigger destructive coping mechanisms. Social media creates artificial comparisons that can undermine confidence and generate unrealistic expectations about the pace of personal progress. Yet these modern conditions make strategic self-mastery more necessary, not less. When external chaos increases, internal stability becomes your primary competitive advantage. When distractions multiply exponentially, focused attention becomes more valuable than any technical skill. When change accelerates beyond comfortable adaptation rates, the ability to remain centered while adjusting to new circumstances becomes essential for sustained success and mental well-being. Begin your war plan by conducting an honest assessment of your current position using the same methodical approach I applied to analyzing enemy territories and friendly capabilities. Map your patterns of self-sabotage with precision that reveals their specific triggers, timing, and consequences. When do you typically procrastinate? And what specific circumstances make procrastination most likely to occur? What situations trigger your fear responses? And how do those fears manifest in your decision-making and behavior? Under what conditions does doubt undermine your confidence? And how does that doubt affect your willingness to take beneficial action? Which environments, people, and activities support your better nature, and which consistently enable your destructive impulses? Create your strategic intelligence by tracking these patterns for at least 2 weeks, noting not just what happens, but the specific conditions that precede both beneficial and destructive choices. Record the times of day when your willpower is strongest and weakest, along with the factors that influence these fluctuations. Identify the people whose presence increases or decreases your effectiveness, and analyze what specific qualities in those relationships create these effects. Observe how different activities, foods, sleep patterns, and environments affect your mental clarity, emotional stability, and physical energy levels. Use this intelligence to design your positioning strategy with the same attention to detail I applied to selecting battlefields that would maximize our advantages while minimizing enemy strengths. Structure your most important work during your periods of peak mental energy, and schedule routine tasks during times when your cognitive resources are naturally lower. Eliminate or minimize exposure to triggers that consistently lead to destructive choices, while increasing your exposure to influences that naturally support beneficial behavior. Create environmental cues that remind you of your larger objectives when immediate impulses threaten to override long-term thinking. Develop your speed tactics by identifying your windows of opportunity for positive change and committing to immediate action when those windows open. Prepare specific responses for common scenarios where quick action can prevent destructive patterns from gaining momentum. Create accountability systems that provide immediate feedback when you begin drifting toward old patterns. Design your small victories plan by choosing the minimum beneficial actions you can sustain consistently regardless of circumstances. These should be actions so small that excuses for avoiding them become obviously ridiculous, yet meaningful, enough to create real momentum toward your larger objectives. Create your strategic retreat protocols by determining in advance how you will respond when you recognize you are fighting from a position of weakness. What will you do when stress levels make good decision-making difficult? How will you handle periods when motivation is low and inspiration feels absent? What support systems will you activate when facing challenges that feel overwhelming? Most importantly, create accountability systems that provide the external feedback your internal enemy tries to distort. Regular check-ins with mentors, coaches, or trusted friends who will give you honest assessments of your progress rather than comfortable encouragement that enables continued self-deception. Metrics that track your actual behavior rather than your intentions, because intentions without corresponding actions are merely sophisticated forms of self-sabotage. Reviews that evaluate results rather than efforts, because effort without results often indicates misdirected energy rather than genuine progress toward meaningful objectives. The goal is not perfection but consistent progress measured over months and years rather than days and weeks. Victory in the internal war is measured not by the absence of destructive impulses but by your improved ability to recognize and redirect them before they can derail your progress toward objectives that truly matter for your long-term well-being and contribution to others. The ultimate aim of warfare is not destruction, but the establishment of lasting peace. When you achieve victory over the enemy within yourself, you create something far more valuable than personal success. You become a source of possibility for others who are fighting their own internal battles against the forces of self-sabotage that limit their potential and diminish their contributions to the world. I learned this principle through observing the ripple effects of strategic victories that extended far beyond their immediate military objectives. When a skilled general demonstrated that a seemingly impossible challenge could be overcome through superior strategy rather than superior force, other commanders began to see new possibilities in their own seemingly hopeless situations. When a previously weak state achieved victory through innovative tactics that leveraged their unique advantages rather than copying conventional approaches, neighboring states adopted and adapted those strategies to their own circumstances and capabilities. Victory achieved through wisdom rather than violence inspired others to seek their own victories through strategic thinking rather than brute force. Your victory over self-sabotage creates similar ripple effects in your family, workplace, and community that extend far beyond your personal achievements. When people observe you consistently following through on commitments despite obstacles and setbacks, they begin to believe that reliable self-discipline is possible for them as well, rather than being a rare gift possessed only by exceptional individuals. When they see you responding to setbacks with strategic thinking rather than emotional reaction, they start to question their own automatic responses to difficulties and consider whether more thoughtful approaches might serve them better. When they witness you making beneficial choices, even when those choices require short-term sacrifice for long-term gain, they begin to examine whether their own immediate gratification patterns are truly serving their long-term interests and happiness. Or transformation gives them permission to believe that their own transformation is possible, not through superhuman willpower or extraordinary circumstances, but through the same strategic approaches that enabled your progress from self-sabotage to self-mastery. But this influence carries corresponding responsibility that increases as your own capabilities expand. Once you have tasted victory over your own internal enemies, you become accountable for using that strength in service of others, rather than merely for personal advantage or comfort. The strategic thinking that overcame your own self-sabotage can help others recognize and address their own destructive patterns. The positioning strategies that supported your beneficial choices can be adapted to others' circumstances and challenges, though they must be customized rather than copied exactly. The small victories approach that built your momentum can be taught to those who feel overwhelmed by the magnitude of change they believe they need to achieve their goals. The strategic retreat methods that preserved your energy during difficult periods can guide others through their own seasons of challenge and uncertainty when direct confrontation with problems would be counterproductive. During my later years, after I had established my reputation through military success, I discovered that my greatest satisfaction came not from personal victories but from teaching others to achieve their own victories using principles I had learned through years of trial, error, and gradual refinement. The strategic insights that had once served only my own ambitions could serve a higher purpose by helping others overcome the obstacles that prevented them from reaching their potential and contributing their unique gifts to the world. This is why I devoted my remaining years to teaching rather than merely conquering additional territories. The principles that brought victory in warfare could serve purposes beyond military success by helping others achieve their own victories over the universal human tendency towards self-sabotage that wastes talent, energy, and opportunity. The same strategic mind that analyzed enemy weaknesses could be applied to understanding and overcoming the patterns of self-limitation that prevent most people from achieving what they are truly capable of accomplishing. Your journey from self-sabotage to self-mastery prepares you to serve others in their own battles against the enemy within in ways that go beyond simple advice or encouragement. You become living proof that victory is possible for ordinary people facing ordinary challenges with extraordinary persistence and strategic thinking. You become a source of practical strategies that have been tested under the pressure of real circumstances rather than theoretical approaches that sound good but fail when applied to messy human reality. You become a reminder that the greatest achievements begin with conquering yourself rather than waiting for external circumstances to align perfectly with your preferences. More importantly, you demonstrate that self-mastery is not about becoming perfect but about becoming effectively, about eliminating all internal resistance but about channeling that resistance toward productive ends that serve your highest values and deepest purposes. The ripple effects of your transformation extend through generations as the people you influence go on to influence others with the same principles and approaches that enabled your own progress. Children who observe parents making strategic choices rather than reactive ones learn decision-making patterns that will serve them throughout their lives. Colleagues who witness leaders responding to pressure with wisdom rather than panic develop their own capacity for remaining centered during challenging circumstances. Friends who see you pursuing long-term objectives despite short-term obstacles gain courage to persist with their own important goals when motivation fluctuates and progress feels slow. This multiplication effect means that your victory over the enemy within yourself serves purposes far beyond your individual success or satisfaction. Every destructive pattern you overcome weakens those same patterns in the collective human experience. Every beneficial habit you establish makes it easier for others to establish similar habits because you demonstrate that such changes are possible for real people facing real obstacles. Every time you choose strategic thinking over emotional reaction, You contribute to a world where wisdom becomes more common and reactive destruction becomes less acceptable. Every time you persist through difficulty toward worthy objectives, you strengthen the cultural belief that meaningful achievement is possible through sustained effort rather than hoping for fortunate circumstances. The war against your own limitations was never meant to be fought for your benefit alone. When you win that war, you join the ranks of those who light the way for others still fighting in the darkness of their own internal conflicts, confusion, and self-defeating patterns. This is the ultimate victory, not just conquering yourself, but helping others discover that they too can win the war within. This is the legacy that matters most, not what you accomplished for yourself, but what you made possible for others through your example, teaching, and service. The enemy within each person may wear different faces and use different tactics, but the strategic principles for defeating that enemy remain constant. Your victory demonstrates that these principles work when applied with persistence, wisdom, and commitment to purposes larger than immediate comfort or convenience. The circle completes itself when those you have helped begin helping others in turn, spreading the understanding that self-mastery is not a rare gift, but a learnable skill. Not an impossible ideal, but an achievable reality for anyone willing to approach their internal challenges with the same strategic thinking that has guided successful leaders throughout history. This is how individual transformation becomes collective elevation, how personal victory becomes universal possibility, and how conquering the enemy within yourself becomes a contribution to conquering the forces of limitation and self-sabotage that diminish human potential everywhere they operate.